Thank you for joining us here on Skilled, Safe, and Trailblazing. If you're responsible for training the next generation of lab professionals or looking to level up your own expertise, you're in the right place. My name is Jessica Martin, and I'm a lab training professional with a background in chemical education research and community empowerment. I'm here to dive with you into the real-world strategies, expert insights, and game-changing discussions that will help us develop lab professionals who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing. Today, we are launching a new series called Mapping Power, Pressure, and Protection. We are examining laboratory safety and lab management in academic research by mapping the roles that shape what happens at the bench. There are plenty of strong ideas generated in the safety world. What's often harder is turning those ideas into daily practice. To do that, we have to understand influence, who impacts whom, where pressure comes from, and how protection is built into the system. If we want research excellence, we have to build the structure that produces it. We're starting where my own entry into laboratory safety began, with the graduate student researcher. And that's when I met today's guest co-host, Monica Hensley, through a peer-led workshop designed to help early career researchers build labs that function well, collaborate strategically, and ultimately do better science through a laboratory safety team led by graduate student researchers. I came through the workshop early in its development and then was mentored by a graduate student leader to step into facilitation and manage the program going forward. A few years later, Monica joined as a participant. I then mentored her to become a facilitator and then to assume leadership after I graduated. Since then, she has mentored new graduate student leaders to take over and continue managing the workshop after her own graduation. That peer-to-peer pipeline is a deliberate leadership succession model we have built into these workshops. Graduate student researchers are guided to intentionally examine the structures that surround them and grapple with the challenges of running strong labs. And then they teach the next cohort to do the same. We were also developing the skills with one another that we could then take back to our respective institutions to build laboratory safety teams. What began as one workshop has since grown into a series, including a second program focused on risk management in the research lab. Today, both continue to be led by rising graduate student researchers. This isn't traditional safety training. It's operational excellence for early career researchers. It's research leadership development. It's about building labs that function well, so the science can too. If you'd like to learn more about these ACS CHAS peer-led workshops, check out the link in the show notes. Now, let's start thinking about this map with Monica. We get asked all the time why we decided to get involved in the workshops.
Ultimately, what brought me to the workshops in my first few years of graduate school was that I found myself feeling alone and confused when it comes to lab safety.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I felt the same way. And it is a really difficult sentiment to get other people to understand who haven't experienced it themselves. You know that there are various actors attempting to make a difference, yet as the person actually working in the labs, it can feel like none of the effort is getting to where it needs to go. And you are always the one getting blamed, even though you have no power, you're under tons of pressure, and no one is offering you any protection.
Riley said, Jessica, and I think for me, part of the challenge was that I was still pretty new in my graduate program and was suddenly immersed in a lab environment with many different chemicals and hazards. As I tried to learn how to conduct my research effectively, I found myself with far more questions than answers about what my safety education should look like and who the artists were.
Absolutely. And having spent some serious time examining it, I really feel like it boiled down to 3 challenges that I experienced as a graduate student researcher: policies that did not connect to reality, legacy messes, and battles over money and authority.
So let's examine each situation. What policy comes to mind for you, Jessica?
One example had to do with the use of chemical fume hoods. We were told that the hoods were inspected every year, and a sticker was placed on each one to say whether they passed, conditionally passed, or failed. A friend of mine worked in a lab in a different building from me, in which they had 3 chemical fume hoods. 1 had passed and 2 had failed.
So that meant they could only use one hood?
And yet they had multiple graduate student researchers working with respiratory hazards in the space.
Well, why didn't the institution just fix the hoods so that they all passed?
The lab group had prevailed on institution leadership to do just that multiple times. They were told that a new building was being built that the lab group would be moved to, and they didn't want to put any more money into the old building.
I suppose that makes sense. How long would it take for the new building to be constructed?
It would take 3 to 5 years.
So, it would take the same length of time as obtaining a PhD.
Exactly. The lab members came up with some clever workarounds to use the failed hoods so that they could get their research done, recognizing the hazards of their experiments, assessing the risks, then deciding which experiments got to use the best engineering controls that day. They also had pretty strict plans for emergencies that included evacuating the lab anytime things didn't feel or smell right. Multiple people graduated while waiting for the transition to the new building. This sense of time felt like a massive disconnect between policy and reality for me. The institution could claim that they had declared the hoods out of service, but the people who would be punished by this situation were individual graduate student researchers who wouldn't be able to complete their research necessary to graduate. The people who made the decision not to spend the money to fix the hoods would not feel the impact of that decision at all.
Wow. Well, I certainly experienced policies that did not connect to reality too. One situation I remember involved transporting a liquid nitrogen dewar between floors in our lab building. Our lab was on the 4th floor, but the refill station was in the building's lower level. So I had to move the dewar in an elevator.
Oh wow, they didn't make you all just take the stairs?
The dewar was too large and heavy to safely carry down the stairs, which introduced a different hazard, as you know, the risk of falling while moving a bulky cryogenic container.
That makes sense. Even with the smaller dewars I used, I had a few close calls when it came to tripping on the stairs and considered the elevator at times, even though we were told to avoid using it for this purpose.
Yeah, that is definitely an issue. While riding in the elevator reduces the likelihood of tripping, it introduces a risk of asphyxiation if nitrogen gas displaces oxygen in the confined space. And since I was moving a large liquid nitrogen dewar, there would be more liquid nitrogen if there was a catastrophic release. The recommended safety practice I had learned was to send the dewar alone in the elevator and have another person waiting on the destination floor to receive it. After refilling, the same process would be repeated to send it back up. I tried doing this a few times, but it required coordinating with another person each time I needed liquid nitrogen.
And as we've covered previously on episode 7, Working Alone, Safety Beyond the 9 to 5, graduate student researchers often find themselves juggling hectic schedules and working on lab work during non-traditional hours, which makes coordinated efforts challenging.
Exactly. Even though the policy may have seemed reasonable to the people setting the policies, for me as a graduate student researcher, it felt like a disconnect between the policies and how the work was actually getting done. And since the probability of a catastrophic release felt pretty low to me, it made hopping in the elevator with that dewar very tempting.
Yeah, I get that. Of course, we just described 2 really big issues to fix. I remember a really silly example of how policy did not jive with reality. Our EHS department decided to do a little campaign encouraging us to test our peroxide formers on an annual basis. After they talked about it, I was convinced, and asked for some test strips to start implementing this in my lab immediately. EHS told me that they didn't supply the test strips, but that our department stockroom did. So I went to the stockroom manager. She said that EHS supplied them. I went back to EHS. They said that they had never supplied them, and they were surprised to hear that our stockroom didn't either. So I went back to our stockroom manager and explained this. Then she told me that the PIs of the labs should probably be responsible for purchasing them. So then I went to my PI. He said that it seemed silly to him for us to purchase them when he was sure that other labs must have some. He then told me to go ask other lab groups.
Wow, this sounds like quite the fiasco.
Yeah. By this point, I had already spent so much of my time in pursuit of these test strips, I almost gave up completely. In all honesty, my lab group had never tested our peroxide formers before, and I wasn't entirely sure why this should be my job now. Then I did a Google search and found that 100 test strips could be purchased at Walmart for $30, so I bought them.
What?
What's even crazier is that when I told this story to others in the department, they started coming to me to ask to use a few. Since we definitely weren't going to use 100 test strips by the expiration date, I was happy to give some away. But I do wonder what all those lab groups, including my own, are doing now.
You would think that if EHS was going to start a campaign to get graduate student researchers to test their peroxide formers, that they would have included a means of acquiring the test strips.
Policies are often built and declared to all before any work is done to figure out if we have the budget or authority to follow the policies. For those new graduate student researchers coming into the lab later, it just ends up looking like a bunch of random rules. Some we follow, some we don't.
Which is unfortunate because those policies are meant to support graduate student researchers working safely in those spaces, but they can sometimes become a roadblock that ends up encouraging unsafe workarounds.
True. And I do get that turning around some bad habits can be supported by policy changes. However, at times, it really felt like the policy changes ignored the legacy messes, which is the second challenge I mentioned.
From unidentified and aging chemicals to excessive stocks of reagents and broken or non-functional equipment, these are the kinds of messes that typically build up in academic labs over time. As researchers come and go, and without clear systems for inventory, maintenance, and disposal, materials and equipment can be left behind and forgotten. At the same time, graduate student researchers are expected to carry out their work while navigating these legacy issues, often with very little guidance about what is in the lab or who is responsible for it, and that could impact research excellence.
The messes that graduate student researchers are often confronted with in laboratory spaces were years or decades in the making. Yet it is a continual struggle to get anyone to address that mess. Then the next group comes in, and for them, it's just the norm. We all learn how to work around and over these messes.
And yet, there is this expectation that graduate student researchers can conduct their research while also taking courses and sometimes teaching. But there are only so many hours in a day, as we know. When you also have to deal with the messes you inherit in a lab just to be able to safely do your research, something inevitably has to give. And I don't think graduate student researchers set out to do lab work in an unsafe manner. But when there are these competing priorities, especially the pleasure to spend more hours on research while also trying to figure out how to deal with these legacy issues, sometimes without even knowing where to start, the experience can be both frustrating and paralyzing.
I remember these issues coming up in a major way when a group of us from the peer-led workshop leadership were invited to put together an ACS webinar about LSTs in 2021.
Oh, yes. When hearing the stories told by other graduate student researchers who were further along than me in their programs, I was stunned to find out that we were going through the same things. Sarah Zinn shared a story in that webinar I will share here. She said, "When I first joined my group, I was pretty struck by how inefficiently everything ran, how dirty everything was, and how little anything was documented. Since I was going to be spending my foreseeable future in this space, I spent much of my second year cleaning up this legacy mess. I was struggling to keep up with the work that would actually get me my PhD. I couldn't work in the environment that I was in, but I was also only harming myself by spending exorbitant amount of time trying to maintain a functional space in the environment that wasn't obviously valued work.
Kaylee Miller shared a similar experience where she said, "We had a reoccurring violation of keeping updated lists of chemicals. The other chemistry building created an inventory program to keep up with this, but because my research building wasn't in a primary chemistry building, we did not have this system. So I spent a lot of time working with our facilities and EH&S staff to come up with solutions. This was probably one of my biggest projects outside of my research. And in the end, we were able to create this basic list of chemicals in our labs, but it is questionable whether it was kept up after I left. How was it that I was in charge of this?"
Well, my own experience was so similar to Kaylee's and Sarah's. In my first year of graduate school, I joined a lab with very poor housekeeping. When my advisor announced an upcoming EH&S safety inspection, I saw it as a chance to finally address some of the safety issues, but that did not happen. After the inspection, a long report came back outlining everything that needed to be fixed. Around the same time, the other students in the lab left, and I became the only one there. I ended up spending much of my first and second year cleaning up the lab, disposing of waste, labeling chemicals, and creating an inventory system just to bring the lab to a basic safety standard. While I'm proud that the work I did made the lab safer for future students, it also took significant time away from my own research. Also, given that good housekeeping was never a big part of the lab, I suspected that as soon as I was gone, none of the work I had done would be maintained.
And it isn't even just about other researchers in the same lab group. My experience included a new PI and lab group being moved in on top of a previous PI's mess. When I first joined the lab, I struggled with using our department's inventory system to find chemicals in my own lab. Then a few years in, the system got even crazier, which triggered me to investigate. What I discovered was that there were several hundred bottles of chemicals that had been left behind by the previous PI who was no longer at the university. Rather than clear them out, these bottles were just left in place when my PI moved in. He was told that the bottles were in the inventory system. However, while the bottles were identified with the spaces, the ownership of these bottles was never transferred to him. Then a few years later, the stockroom manager decided to archive all of the bottles associated with the old PI.
That sounds like chaos. So what happened?
I approached the stockroom manager about it. She advised that I bring the chemical bottles in question down to her, and she would restock them in the inventory. After I brought about 5 or 6 boxes of chemicals down to her, she asked me how many more I was expecting to bring. I told her that I was almost finished going through the first of 3 different lab spaces. She was shocked.
Oh man, that sounds so time consuming.
It was. And on top of it, my PI and a senior member of my lab kept treating this process like it was an imposition, and I was being silly for doing it. So just like Sarah mentioned in her story, it wasn't even considered valued work by the leadership of the lab group. But I had experiences working in labs at different places with good chemical inventories. It made the work so much easier.
True. To me, it gave me this peace of mind to do my research, knowing that I have the space and the tools to do my science in the most efficient way and using my time to do the work I wanted to focus on 100%.
There were some folks who observed that this group that came together to make this webinar just happened to be female, and started to speculate on why that was. Why did women feel the need to clean up after others and organize like, quote unquote, the mom of the lab? And that way of characterizing the situation really angered me. In fact, it still does. Our common thread was that we all noticed how much this mess slowed everything down. We were all high-performing, extremely motivated early career researchers, and we all found ourselves working in spaces that slowed us down, disrupted our progress, and threatened the integrity of our work. It is how we decided on the title of the webinar, Enhancing Research Productivity Through Student-Led Laboratory Safety Teams. The webinar is linked in the show notes, although please be aware that you must be an ACS member to access it. And trying to resolve the issues of disconnected policies and legacy messes led to the third experience I mentioned, discovering how battles over money and authority served to undermine any sense of a positive safety culture.
Exactly. My experience with transporting heavy cryogenic containers between floors highlighted a broader structural issue for me as well. The safety guidance focused on individual behavior, how researchers should use the elevators, but it did not address the structural challenge of repeatedly transporting heavy cryogenic containers between floors. In other words, the issue was not just how we used elevators, but why researchers had to rely on them so frequently to obtain liquid nitrogen in the first place. One could ask why this was the situation the graduate student researcher was faced with and what are the barriers. Are there structural issues that contributed to the graduate student researcher putting their life at risk of asphyxiation in case of a leak of liquid nitrogen as they transport the dewar with them in the elevator? I think this highlights the battle of money and how that could show itself in how graduate student researchers navigate what they need for productive research.
Good point. And even with smaller items, it could help if leadership more intentionally thought about how policies translate for graduate student researchers. Going back to my story about the peroxide former test strips, it makes no sense to put graduate student researchers in the middle of battles over who should purchase what. When newbies are witnessing leaders having to pick and choose where to spend their political capital, it undermines the ability of that newbie to trust the system. Then, the newbie develops their own bad habits that mirror what they are seeing. Now, I had my first experience with the workshops while I was starting to grapple with these issues. There were two particularly impactful things for me that I still remember vividly from the first of these workshops I attended. First, the conversation was being led by graduate student researchers. By having the conversation led by them, it meant that the default could not be that we were just dumb, or we just didn't listen, or didn't do what we were told. Instead, there was an immediate empathy for the tough situations that graduate student researchers are put in, an understanding of the power dynamics with which we were faced, the pressure we were under, and the lack of protection we had when we challenged current circumstances.
And those workshops were instrumental in providing some of the answers to the questions I had, and also just getting exposure on how it is and can be done through discussions with other graduate students who were in productive or relatively safer labs, as well as those who had navigated similar situations. It was quite eye-opening for me to be part of the discussions that were happening during the workshop because for the first time, I felt validated about the concerns I had in the lab I was working in. Just hearing other graduate students across the field share similar stories about dealing with legacy messes and navigating who could help gave me the confidence and empowerment I needed to start talking to other graduate student researchers in the department and asking some questions about how to collectively navigate these critical situations, wanting to find some kind of solution to these systemic issues. I was fired up to take action in my local setting because I had somebody who was just like me, navigating a chemistry doctoral degree and experiencing problems they had nothing to do with originally creating.
Exactly. The second thing I remember were the conversations being had by the non-graduate student researchers in the room. While the majority who attended were graduate student researchers, Some others were safety professionals, some were administrators, and they were all from different institutions. There were a handful of them who did engage in a rather heated discussion about the barriers that exist when trying to address infrastructure or resource issues to improve lab safety. This was the first time that I really got to see the mask slip. It turned out leadership didn't have it all figured out. Not only did this make me feel better about my own struggles with trying to understand the landscape, it also opened up the possibility that I might actually be able to help improve things by sharing my experiences.
And those conversations with the non graduate student participants usually made the discussions richer for me because they usually added context to the topics being discussed that the graduate student researcher might not have, like adding a piece to a puzzle that makes it start making sense. And I also think the space the workshop provided allowed for honest conversations between the graduate student researchers and the non-graduate student participants, as you rightly said, Jessica. We got to see the mask slip. Maybe it's because the graduate students were getting attention from folks we don't really get to engage with in such conversations. That is, somebody was actually listening to have a conversation and not to make you feel stupid or dumb.
And as you know, Monica, that is the energy I brought to discussions later when we were working on explicitly developing stated goals for the workshop. We already knew that it was important to educate participants about the importance of risk assessment on their own experiments. But this workshop was about more than individuals attaining knowledge for themselves. We were also guiding participants towards gaining awareness of safety culture messages from leadership at institutions because it was important to gain a systems-level view of where the mismatches were. This was critical for attendees who intended on staying in academia because what we were really trying to build here were the change agents. It was also important for those entering government or industry labs. We kept hearing that these labs function differently from academia, so we wanted to do our part in sensitizing our attendees to that messaging. Finally, we wanted to empower participants to expand their safety networks and ultimately to develop laboratory safety teams. Again, it wasn't enough to learn about risk assessment, nor was it enough to become aware of safety messaging. They needed to use this knowledge to take action at their institutions. Sometimes that action is supporting better training for your fellow graduate student researchers, but other times, that action is organizing to demand that a systemic issue be addressed by leadership.
Educate, guide, empower. It was this way of thinking about safety training for graduate student researchers that inspired me to become involved with running the workshops. And while I was building an LST with my mates at my own institution, it was great to keep coming back to this growing group with the same goals and similar challenges to work together towards overcoming them.
When addressing why busy graduate student researchers were interested in developing laboratory safety teams, Sarah said it best on the webinar when she stated, "Often the proclivity is to view the foundational motivation for these teams in a fundamentally positive light. But the more that we talk to the leaders of these teams, the more that we realize that often their motivation stems from difficulties that they have personally experienced, specifically in their own lab spaces. Productivity losses that are due to inefficient organizational systems." Monica, you and I kept uncovering these stories as we continued to run the workshops, and we decided to do a research project to share this narrative with the community. In the publication, Laboratory Safety Teams as an Evolving Community of Practice, Exploring the How and Why, we intentionally explored the value that these graduate student researchers were attributing to their work with the workshops and their own LSTs. We have linked the paper in the show notes. Several of these graduate student researchers described feelings of isolation in their programs and characterized the LST space as a place to receive validation for their concerns and in which it was safe to ask for help. Having a place to share the stories also enabled these people to develop some benchmarking so that they could articulate where their departments are now, where they wanted to build into the future, and they could explore ideas about how to get there. While this could have been a negative experience, making folks feel like things were bad everywhere, it had the opposite effect, as we both know. Instead, people felt motivated to build ideas together to change their home environments. These folks shared an understanding of personal risk and a deep sense of responsibility, yet felt like they didn't have the time, budget, or authority to enact the changes that needed to happen unless they found a different way to articulate their concerns. Laboratory safety teams felt like part of the answer.
You know, when we started interviewing participants for this study, many of whom we've been working with over the past few years in the workshop, I probably could have guessed some of the reasons they wanted to contribute as graduate students, like building professional development skills. But I was genuinely surprised to learn that most of us kept coming back for years because the workshop offered a space to navigate the safety challenges we were facing whilst doing our research in our labs. It gave us a community of fellow graduate student researchers who were dealing with messy, real world situations every day and figuring out ways to manage them without losing our minds.
Exactly. We weren't dummies walking into perfectly functioning systems who were messing everything up. Nor were we rebels who stubbornly refused to be told what to do inside of an otherwise reasonable situation. We were intelligent and motivated people who were early in our careers, trying to soak up everything we could to figure out how to be successful in our chosen fields. If you have graduate student researchers regularly making decisions that you feel violate your rules, you need to ask yourself what in the system is supporting and rewarding that behavior. And then we decided to try to do just that, didn't we? We've now spent years together grappling with the question, how do we leverage the various actors in academia to create a structure that inspires and rewards graduate students to grow into more effective, more productive, more collaborative researchers?
I think my first safety inspection was the moment I realized that it wasn't just the PI who shaped how research was done. I had always been asking my advisor for direction, but in the lab, I struggled to reconcile what I was told with what I was actually experiencing. Legacy chemicals, messy housekeeping, and unclear responsibilities. When the task of addressing the safety issues from the inspection fell to me, as the only graduate student left in the group, it opened my eyes to other actors in the space. It also opened a line of communication with the EHS office, which turned out to be incredibly supportive, helping answer many of the questions I had and manage some of the emotions I was feeling while navigating these complex safety issues.
I definitely had some similar experiences. While I also had some great mentors from unexpected places, I did have a lot of conversations in which I realized that those working in the field weren't thinking about things this way. There seemed to be very little focus on how the very workers that safety professionals were trying to influence were actually being influenced. To be clear, I don't think anyone is being a bad person here. I don't think anyone in this space genuinely believes that safety isn't the right thing to do. Instead, I think it has to do with the incredibly high degree of fragmentation in the system around laboratory operations that exists at academic institutions. So, who are the workers in academic research labs? Let's start with our own graduate school experiences. When I started graduate school, my graduate lab consisted of a primary investigator, who was almost never in the lab, a research scientist who did not see his role as training, organizing, or mentoring the graduate students in the lab, and 3 other graduate student researchers, one of whom abandoned the program shortly after I joined the lab. At the beginning of your program, who was in your lab?
I was in a different situation, being the only graduate student in the lab at the time. When I joined the lab, there were 2 other graduate student researchers who were just about to leave and were focused on prepping for their dissertation defense at the time. There was also an undergraduate student researcher who was not so active in the lab at the time.
Right. A few years later, we had acquired a few more graduate student researchers, and my PI recruited a handful of undergraduate student researchers. Although he was just as disengaged as before, so the graduate student researchers had no guidance or plan for how to train or work with the undergraduates. Ultimately, I did what I could to pull together the graduate student researchers in the lab to come up with some sort of standardized training and guidance. And it was essentially based on several things we wished someone had provided for us as we entered our first research lab environments, as well as some basic needs the lab had at the time. In fact, our first explicit SOPs were written during this process collaboratively with the undergraduates.
After 2 years in the lab, with little to no guidance on productive research, among other reasons, I decided to join a new research lab. During the 2 years I had been in my previous lab, no new graduate student joined, and the undergraduate researcher left after completing a coursework master's degree. Surprisingly, my new lab was a complete 180 compared to my old lab in terms of research productivity. The issues I had spent my first years navigating, such as legacy chemicals, poor housekeeping, unclear responsibilities, and limited mentorship, were largely absent, and I finally had the support and structure needed to focus on my own research. But while I was in my old lab, I had vowed to not let a new graduate student go through what I was experiencing and would openly share about my experience with graduate students who joined the department.
It's really great to hear that that lab change was so positive for you, but that you also didn't forget what it was like in the old situation. And as you know, Monica, our experiences are not unique. When we talk about the people who do the work in academic research labs, we are primarily talking about graduate students. While there are postdocs, research scientists, lab managers, and other staff members hired, they collectively represent a minority of the people working in the space and are typically a sign of an individual PI successfully winning some big grants, as opposed to a department making decisions about how to organize lab personnel. The graduate students represent the majority of workers in labs, and in many cases, undergraduate students represent a second large group. This is why I tend to insist upon abandoning the term graduate student for these folks and instead embrace the term graduate student researcher. They are students when they are the people receiving instruction in teaching labs, but when performing the work in research labs, they are the workers. They are the researchers. I have experienced a propensity in the lab safety community to try to discuss students separately from workers. But when looking at the people working in an academic research lab, if you exclude the students, you have very few people left.
With graduate student researchers being the majority of lab workers and having to be the ones to navigate the power, pressure, and protection dynamics of doing productive research, in addition to other competing priorities, it often feels like walking a tightrope. As Jessica said earlier, graduate student researchers are not stubborn rebels when it comes to safe research. It's just that often they don't know what to do and are trying their best to figure out stuff in a way that makes sense and supports the research they love to do.
Now, within this context, Monica and I built a graphic a few years ago in an effort to sketch out what the lab safety influence landscape really looks like from the perspective of a graduate student researcher working in an academic research lab. And we struggled. We have shared the original graphic and a summary of this discussion in a LinkedIn blog post that is linked in the show notes. You can check out the graphic there if you would like a visual to help you follow this discussion. One thing you'll notice right away is that we crafted the graphic to show that our fellow lab-based researchers have the biggest influence on us, even more than the PI of the lab. And this made sense to me personally, because these were the people I spent time with in the lab every day. And they were also the ones who educated me on which people or offices could help me with various tasks. Unfortunately, in my case, this also included conversations about how they did not find EH&S particularly helpful, already coloring my view of safety professionals in a negative way.
And this might be the same as a battle over authority, but in my experience, it sometimes showed up as open frustration or even blatant disrespect towards anything related to safety. I remember working with a PI who seemed visibly annoyed whenever safety requirements came up and occasionally made dismissive comments about EHS professionals who were simply doing their jobs. Moments like that reinforced a common misconception in research settings that safety is something that slows research down rather than something that enables it to happen responsibly. Experiences like these subtly shaped how I thought about lab safety at the time. They communicated, often indirectly, what behaviors were valued and rewarded in the lab and which ones were seen as inconvenient or unnecessary. When the people in positions of authority signal frustration towards research safety, it can create pressure, especially for the graduate student researcher, to prioritize productivity over safe work. At the same time, I still had a research project to complete, an experiment that needed to move forward. So instead of disengaging, I became determined to find ways to navigate these messy and sometimes frustrating situations.
Right. And not only have we heard this from other graduate students, but a study came out in 2019 that found evidence that the engagement of postdocs and senior graduate students in laboratory interactions has a more significant impact on skill development than PIs. That paper is linked in the show notes. We placed the head of the department and the department safety committee as the next most influential. Although, to be fair, they certainly felt very far away in terms of influence in my daily lab activities. I often wondered if the head of my department or the people on my department safety committee actually knew how poor my PI's engagement was with our lab group, or if it mattered to them. Each PI was so focused on their own lab group, it was hard for me to imagine that they were paying attention to anyone else's lab group, or that they would act if they were concerned about anything.
Huh. The sentiment was constantly in my mind while I was dealing with my lab safety challenges. And I still wonder up till today why other labs or PIs do not do anything about what graduate students researchers experience in another lab. Meanwhile, the whole time I was dealing with stuff in my first years in graduate school, I was relying on the guidance of other graduate student researchers in more productive and functioning research labs to do safe research.
Next, we placed entities like EH&S facilities and the Research Safety Office. When I started graduate school, the influence of these actors was very spotty and virtually non-existent. And yet, I felt like there was so much potential here because of their specialities and what they did. These were some of the positions I was referring to when I mentioned the heated discussion I witnessed in attending my first peer-led workshop. Of course, none of the people attending the workshop were from my institution, but witnessing these folks from other institutions engage in this heated discussion made it possible for me to appreciate that they likely thought about people in my position more often than it felt.
You know, as I became more involved in the workshops, I really felt that lab safety teams could have the greatest impact by building bridges between the graduate student researchers and EH&S and facilities. When I was dealing with the challenges in my first lab, there was so much I learned from these folks that could ultimately make me a better lab manager. However, it would have been helpful to connect these people outside of the immediate pressure of inspections.
I agree, Monica. Our LST had some great experiences engaging with our EH&S folks, but it also became clear pretty quickly that they were grossly understaffed for what they were expected to accomplish. Finally, we placed some small markers for offices like the president, dean, provost, all of these higher up administrative roles running the university. As a graduate student researcher engaging in the safety professional space, I kept hearing people assert that the responsibility for lab safety ultimately sits with the president. From my perspective, this was very hard to understand. I had never met the president of my university, I had never seen him walk through any labs, and I had never heard him say anything about research or laboratory safety. At the time, I couldn't imagine any of these folks playing any role at all. We also decided to add spots for the ACS and for SHIMA. although these influences are highly debatable. As a chemist, I think that I witnessed some influence from the ACS, especially since I did have faculty members who were active members. However, I do recognize that outside of chemistry departments, there are loads of people working in wet labs in academia who have never heard of ACS. And of course, there are other membership organizations that likely have a larger influence in non-chemistry departments. Now, regarding SHIMA, we intentionally overlapped their sphere of influence only with the EHS, Facilities and Research Safety Circle. Again, as a graduate student researcher engaging in the safety professional space, I had come to appreciate the substantial role that SHIMA was playing for EHS and facilities as a membership organization, but it was unlikely that folks working in the labs were aware of their influence.
Riley said, Jessica, as a graduate student researcher myself, who was fortunate enough to learn about organizations such as ACS and SHIMA through my institution, those opportunities were real game changers for me. Especially for ACS, the experience and exposure opened my eyes to a broader community of people working to improve research safety in academic laboratories and helped me see that many of the challenges I had faced as a graduate student researcher were not isolated experiences, but part of a larger systemic issues that others were also working to address.
When it comes to how graduate student researchers interact with these lab environments, they are renters, not owners. By definition, their time in the space is brief, and their influence on overall infrastructure is limited. Yet, this is also where they are learning about what it means to manage a lab. If they remain in academia, the next step up from graduate student researcher or postdoc is faculty member, building out their own lab group. The transition from brief renter to decades-long owner happens pretty quickly. Alex Miller and Ian Tonks briefly discussed the difficulty of this transition in an editorial back in 2018, which is linked in the show notes. This is an important aspect for anyone to consider who is hoping to influence laboratory safety.
While it doesn't completely fill the gap, that is why we advocate for lab safety teams in the peer-led workshops. This is a way to start building that educational bridge between EHS and graduate student researchers in the hopes that we will help to build folks who are a bit better prepared to manage labs in their futures. We emphasize finding community with other graduate students in their department who might have similar questions they are seeking answers to or situations they are navigating. We also strongly recommend that they reach out to their EHS about situations they need help with. For nothing at all, they will find out if the EHS office can be a partner for safe research work beyond solvent waste pickup. We are also calling upon graduate student researchers to examine their own mindset and behaviors and how they have been shaped by the safety messages, directly or indirectly, they are receiving from faculty, department chairs, safety committees, and others. And finally, we encourage them to pursue relevant professional development outside of their own department to become better lab stewards. And of course, our audience is already doing that by attending the peer-led workshops. They can up their game further with us by getting involved in running the workshops themselves. This keeps them engaged in thinking about lab management and safety issues and discussing them with others.
A good thought exercise for all of you. To try to see things from the graduate student researcher perspective, consider how work inside of labs at your institution gets done. At this point, refrain from assigning blame or jumping directly into who should be responsible. Instead, just think about the situations that these early career people are walking into and what they are seeing. Are lab workers working around a mess that existed before them? Are they trying to find space in the lab for their own work by moving aside work that no longer belongs to anyone working in this lab? Are they trying to work on addressing inspection items that they know little about? Are they being required to engage with systems that don't help them do their research better? For example, dysfunctional chemical inventory systems, poorly defined hazardous waste procedures, challenges with space. What the LST movement is really saying to anyone who will listen, if you want us to be more productive, you have to help us clean up this junk and fix these systems so they support the research. Laboratory safety isn't separate from productivity, it enables it. Today's episode is part of a new series called Mapping Power, Pressure, and Protection. We're examining laboratory safety and lab management in academic research by mapping the roles that shape what happens at the bench. I am going to be using our graphic in the LinkedIn blog post that we mentioned earlier, and that will be linked in the show notes, to intentionally explore these different roles in future episodes. And we will be working to update this graphic for our community and for the peer-led workshops. If you are interested in contributing to this development, let me know by either emailing me at skilledsafeandtrailblazing@gmail.com, commenting in our LinkedIn community linked in the show notes, or leaving a comment on this episode. And we thank Monica very much for triggering this conversation and joining us in today's episode. Thank you for all you do to develop lab workers who are skilled, safe, and trailblazing.
Skilled, safe, and trailblazing is meant for those working in labs or training others to do so. The information shared here is a starting point, not a complete guide or legal standard. We've done our best to use reliable sources, but we make no guarantees about accuracy or completeness. Always follow local, state, and federal laws and consult legal or safety experts if you have questions.